But at the same time, within Uganda, young reporters went out and started using Skype or taping their own response.
Okay.
And there's a Ugandan reporter named Rose Bell, and her video response was viewed by more than 1.5 million people as a few days ago. Because young people are becoming adept. If invisible children can employ this strategy, there's no reason why our young people here in the United States and on the continent cannot use this same technology. So I think those of us who are a bit more senior now, if we really want to provide a useful legacy, we should try to harness the skills of young people and maybe guide them in some of the issues that, if resolved, we can start the march toward development in Africa.
Meanwhile, while we're preparing to do that, what do we do to the African Union, especially the leadership, the way the leadership is going, that they can come to the United Nations and vote against Africa's interests?
Right.
Meanwhile, how do we address this question?
Well,
or issue?
Yeah, and that it's almost like a catch-22. If we have leaders who don't care for the welfare of their own countries, leaders who see power as a personal journey, then we have problems. And you're referring most likely to the vote to authorize the intervention in Libya.
In Libya, yes.
Which, without the votes, it was South Africa, I believe, Gabon,
and Nigeria.
And Nigeria,
right,
which wants to emerge as a power and to be respected. But those three countries abdicated Africa's interest, because, as many people suspected, while in terms of longevity in office, you know, Libya had its issues. It's reasonable to expect that there were a significant portion of Libyans that were interested in seeing how do we transition into the next generation of leadership or younger leaders. But that is hardly to say that they were inviting the kind of assault
or foreign
intervention in Libya. Not only intervention, it was I think it was Putin who said it was like a crusade, like a medieval crusade, which is precisely what it was. Up to date, NATO or the UN has not conducted a proper investigation into how many civilians were actually killed by Gaddafi's army during the conflict, by the so-called rebels, and by NATO bombings. I would not be surprised if several-fold people were killed by the bombings than by any of the combatant sides in Libya. There was one report, I remember, in the city of Zlatan alone, 85 civilians were reported killed. And the kind of indiscriminate bombing of cities and the capital as well. Yeah, I submit that this kind of bombing would not have been conducted against a European country, even if they were trying to dislodge somebody in Europe. We remember the Bosnian War, when some of the worst atrocities were being committed there. We never saw this kind of indiscriminate bombing to protect civilians there. But then the most outrageous thing was that the voice of Africa was completely ignored. Ignored by the administration here, ignored by the British and the French, ignored by NATO, and ignored by media.
Right.
I remember an article that anybody can Google in the New York Times.
Okay.
Which, by the way, the New York Times conducted some of its most shameful journalism during that period, openly promoting this vicious assault. I remember a few editorials were actually criticizing NATO for not bombing enough. And I said, would the New York Times ever make a similar demand if the victims were Europeans? I really doubt it. But getting back to this particular article, the article claimed that Gaddafi refused an African Union proposal to end the war with a ceasefire. It's a complete falsehood.
Right.
It's a lie. In fact, he agreed to a ceasefire, number one. When President Zuma finally came to his senses and realized the shameful thing he had done by voting to authorize the intervention. And he ended up having to go back at least 2 or 3 times to Libya. He agreed to a ceasefire. Gaddafi did. He agreed to creating a safe passage for people involved, victims in the conflict. And then, most importantly, he agreed to hold elections.
Right.
That all the parties would participate openly, and it would be monitored internationally. But it was the French, the British, and the US that was not interested in having such an agreement in place, because there was no guarantee that in an open election that Gaddafi might not actually win.
Right.
So after investing all those resources in warfare and regime change, they were not about to take that chance. In fact, the so-called National Transitional Council government was instructed not to agree to sign on to the peace deal when they sent a delegation to one of the African Union meetings, I think in Equatorial Guinea.
Right.
And there were some reports that they had actually agreed to it, you know, and people can Google that. They agreed to it. I think they actually agreed, but as soon as they got back to Benghazi, you know, I wouldn't be surprised if Sarkozy was on the phone saying, "You're not going to sign any agreement. This is my war and not your war." And so you talk about Africa independence. What independence? When France, a relatively minor country, can dictate policy towards Africa.
Whole continent.
A whole continent.
Of almost a billion.
A billion people. With resources that, you know, France just salivates to have 0.001% of, you know? So we have to get our act together. At the end of the day, you can't be blaming France, Britain, United States, you know, if your house is not in order. I don't care whose responsibility it is. If you walk out of your home today and you leave the windows open, you leave the doors open, you leave the gate to your home open, and you come back home and you start crying, what happened?
Right.
People will say you're crazy.
Yes.
So that's how we have to start looking at this situation.
Mr. Alimadi, I have done some shows almost about 5 times, especially on this, the Libyan situation. There was even a demonstration in Harlem that I covered it. But you and I are talking, and we're in the same business of informing the masses.
Right.
We want to change people's minds.
Right.
The way they view things.
Right.
The way they take the world, you know, things coming around, you know, how they should supposed to dissect things and critically analyze things and understand
Right.
what is going on. Did you talk to the people?
I think it's important because increasingly it's quite clear that the competition over resources is reach a very critical stage. Something that we didn't even discuss yet is displacement. People are being thrown out of their lands in African countries so that foreign companies can come and buy off those lands to feed people in their countries, while Africans are being displaced from their ancestral land by the government of their own countries. These are the kind of calamities that are occurring. In the case of Libya, one of the worst things that happened in this war was the inflaming of the racist sentiments, especially from the people in from Misrata,
Benghazi,
against people that look like you and I
right.
in Libya. The whole city of Tawaga, with a population of 35,000, was emptied. Many killed, and most are now living as refugees in their own country, all over the country.
Okay, Brother Almighty, we are almost run out of time.
I want to thank you for having me on your show.
I appreciate this.
And my enduring message is this: young people, think for yourselves, do your own research, but be hopeful, because young people can change the world.
Thank you. African traditionalism is different. Different is not deficient. Different is not uncivilized. Different is not devilish. Different is just different. For those of you who are my regular viewers, I thank you for your patronage. For those of you watching this show for the first time, I hope you've learned something, because this is a journey with African traditionalism. May Amen Re, that my tradition calls now winning, bless you.